Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to move into our afternoon session and welcome our 12:30 speaker. Before I do that, I'll just introduce myself again very briefly. My name is Manny Leto. I'm the executive director of Preserve the Berg, and we're very excited to partner this year with our friends of the county and our friends of the museum for this event and bringing in really these top-notch speakers from across the state. The other thing I want to do just very quickly is acknowledge our sponsors for this event: AARP Tampa Bay, Design Styles Architecture, MR Capital Advisors, Southern Roots Realty, and of course all of the great vendors in the gallery downstairs. Please spend some time with those folks. So I'm really excited to introduce what we have built. We build it as a keynote speaker because that's how we feel. We're very excited. This is actually the second time that Melissa Wyllie has come to St. Petersburg on behalf of or for Preserve the Berg. So we really appreciate her time here in St. Petersburg. Melissa has led the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, which is the statewide nonprofit dedicated to protecting Florida's history and heritage since 2016. A historic preservationist, writer, and nonprofit leader, Melissa has worked to connect with a broader community to promote the preservation and inclusive sharing of the diverse architectural, historical, and archaeological heritage of Florida. She is a Clearwater native. She was raised in Port Charlotte, and she now lives with her two daughters in Tallahassee, where the trust is located. Please welcome Melissa Wyllie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. As Manny mentioned, I am a Clearwater native. My family still lives here, so this is just secretly, don't tell anybody, but this is maybe my favorite part of the state. So thank you for being here today. Oops, excuse me. So what we're going to talk about overall is how preservation sort of happened this year during our legislative session. And we're going to talk about the Florida Trust's 4 major strategic initiatives that we focused on for this legislative session. And then we'll wrap up with maybe some next steps and things to think about for next year's session, which will begin in January. So we won't even have a full calendar year to recover from the trauma of this year's session. JK, just kidding. So here is just to start, I always like to tell the beginning of my preservation story. Like many of you, I didn't know I was a preservationist for a while. I didn't maybe have the words to describe how I felt. But built spaces in our environment and historic places were very important to me from a young age. So I'm from Clearwater. So here is the house that my dad grew up in Druid Hills, and that is me. I'm the first one, the tallest one, and that's my cousin, and then that's my little sister. It's her birthday today, and this was us at our grandparents' house in Clearwater, and it was a very important place for our family. My dad grew up there. There's my dad, and it was almost like another member of the family. But when my grandma passed away, very suddenly, my grandfather kind of couldn't really cope with all of that, so he sold the house, and I felt how the loss of that building was almost like losing another member of the family. And then it was demolished. And my family felt that very strongly, and they continue to feel that and kind of work through that in the way they tell their stories. And I realized that our built environment enables us to tell stories in a different way, in a very personal way. And that was sort of my entrance into historic preservation. So I always like to talk about how do we define historic preservation, because I don't know that there is really just one definition for it. This is Fort Mose in St. Augustine. Has anybody been there? Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful historic place. It's very historically significant. It was founded in the 1700s. It was a place where formerly enslaved people came and had an entire sort of world of their own there. But what's interesting is there is no longer a fort there. But that doesn't mean the history isn't important and that space isn't important. So a historic preservation philosophy and definitions shouldn't exclude that cultural history piece. So here's just one quick definition for us to think through as we consider why it is we do the work that we do. Historic preservation helps preserve the memories of those who came before us, not just the memories of those who owned and lived in historic places, but of a community, the people who designed it and built it, and the memory of what may have happened in that space. So you can go to Fort Mose and experience the memory of what happened in that space, even though there is not currently a fort there, although I do believe they are working to remedy that. So here's what we're going to talk about real quick today, and then at the end we'll have some questions, and I hope you'll ask me anything you would like to. We're going to talk about the Florida Trust advocacy work, an overview of this year's legislative priorities that we worked for. We're going to talk quickly about the Florida Historic Tax Credit Alliance, which we created this year, and then we'll talk about next steps for 2024. And we're going to go quickly because we have a lot of great speakers today, but if you'd like to learn more, we do have a table downstairs. You could come by and learn more about the Florida Trust. We'd love to talk to you. So Manny read our mission already, but this is what we work to achieve. It's a very broad mission, including archaeological artifacts, cultural heritage, historic buildings, and historic communities and main streets. Here's our mission. We have these 4 pillars that we work to support our mission. We do advocacy, which is what we're going to talk about today. We focus on education, which includes a conference that we'll be holding in Ocala in a few months. We also focus very significantly on connecting with preservationists and communities around the state and making sure they have the tools they need to do the work in their own communities, because as we know, preservation is really local. So that's kind of what we're doing today. We're talking about advocacy, but we're also connecting with preservationists here in St. Petersburg. And then finally, we work on historic property stewardship, and we have an easement program. And we can talk a little bit about that incentive, but I know the incentive conversation will happen after me. So here is just kind of a montage of some of the photos from our work during the legislative session this year. We have a legislative advocacy day every year at the beginning part of session. We have people come from around the state. We connect them with their lawmakers. We give them some communication materials. We help them to tell the story of their communities to their lawmakers while they're in Tallahassee. So this is a montage of all of that work going on. You are welcome to join us if you would like to. You could just sign up downstairs. Next year we'll be doing this work in January, and we do like to have fun. An important part of our work and our strategy is not to just go it alone, but to collaborate with other organizations around the state and even nationally. So here are some of the folks that we collaborated with during this legislative session. We mentioned the Tax Credit Alliance that we created, and we'll talk about that more a little later. We work very closely with the Florida Main Street Program and the Division of Historical Resources, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And a few years ago, we helped to create the Coalition for Florida's Historic Places. This is a group of statewide organizations that all advocate for preservation in some way, shape, or form. So the focus of their mission may be archaeological, it may be anthropological, it might be traditional historic preservation such as ours, but we all kind of are working in that same space. So we figured it may be better to work together and speak more loudly together than for us all to kind of go it alone. So here are the organizations that are in that Coalition for Florida's Historic Places. And then this year we also had a very strong partner of the Miami Design Preservation League that helped us on a particularly worrisome piece of legislation that we all worked together for. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So we started out with 3 legislative priorities, and then we quickly had to grow that to 4 to respond to a risk for our historic places in the state. But our 3 priorities were to work to establish a statewide historic tax credit, to protect Florida's abandoned historic cemeteries, to fully fund the fiscal year 2024 Historic Preservation Special Category Grant List, and then finally the reactive piece I mentioned was to amend a preemptive bill to remove local regulation over demolitions in historic neighborhoods and outside of historic neighborhoods too. So first up, establishing a state historic tax credit. This has been a big focus for us for a few years now, and we were very fortunate this year to have some really strong supporters in both the House and the Senate. This is us with our Senate sponsor, Nick DeSigli, who's from here in Pinellas County. He was a wonderful advocate for this initiative for us. It is going to be called the Main Street Historic Tourism and Revitalization Act. It had a Senate bill, it had a House bill, and it would create a 20% historic tax credit for eligible historic buildings throughout the state, but that would increase to a 30% tax credit for those eligible buildings that were in a Florida Main Street district. So that would have been a very important tool, an incentive for our communities throughout the state, and it would automatically marry with the federal historic tax credit, which is an additional 20%. So for some projects around the state in a Main Street community, that could be a 50% tax credit, and that could really move the needle for a lot of programs and projects coming to fruition. So we had a pretty significant communication strategy for this. We had economic impact reports. We did a lunch and learn. We did an I Heart Old Buildings campaign during Valentine's Day. We went to all of our lawmakers and gave them little buttons and talked about historic places they love. We had one-pagers. I testified at committee hearings in support of the bill. And we also did this really great hard hat tour at the Union Terminal Warehouse building in Jacksonville. It is a project that is utilizing the federal historic tax credit. It is the largest project that has utilized the federal historic tax credit in Florida. And we walked lawmakers and the Secretary of State Cord Bird through this project to give them an idea of the scope of these kind of projects and the economic impact it could have. And it was a very successful event and helped us to tell the story in more tangible ways. So we talked about the Senate sponsor, Nick DeSigli. It was co-introduced by last year's sponsor, Senator Ana Maria Rodriguez, and then Senator Stewart also co-signed on that. In the House, our sponsor was Representative Paula Stark. She's a wonderful advocate for preservation and is herself a Main Street Executive Director in St. Cloud. And the prime co-sponsor for that was Jacksonville Representative Jessica Baker. And we had co-introducers of Representatives Escamani, Salzman, and Tant. So we had very strong bipartisan support for this, and the strategy was ultimately to be included in the tax bill. So we made it into the Senate tax bill, and then when we went to work through that sort of final reconciliation for a full tax bill, we did not make it into the final taxation package. So this is a fight we will be fighting again next year, an opportunity, I should say, instead of a fight. So we will work on all of this again because we do truly believe a tax credit for our state would be a tremendous incentive for our people in our historic places. Our second strategic focus for advocacy was protecting Florida's abandoned historic cemeteries. Many of you probably know that 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, we created at the state level the African American Cemetery Task Force that looked at some of the issues that were going on in Florida and had this advisory committee to come up with recommendations for how we can work on this problem in the state of Florida. So the bill that we're going to talk about was actually one of the solutions proposed by that task force. So it was the Abandoned and Historic Cemeteries Bill. It was House Bill 49 and Senate Bill 430, and it would create a historic cemeteries program within the Division of Historical Resources. So it would provide actual tools for people who have a abandoned cemetery, a forgotten cemetery in their district, and they don't know where to start. Now there's a resource and a place that we would be able to direct them towards. This is another piece of legislation that had very strong bipartisan support. This is the picture here is Minority Leader and sponsor Representative Driscoll presenting the bill to the House Infrastructure and Tourism Appropriations Committee. The wonderful support of this bill throughout the process. And in that process, I heard this wonderful quote from our Representative Caruso. He's the vice chair of the State Affairs Committee. But everybody has a story about a cemetery or a historic cemetery, and everyone has a reason that it matters to them. But I thought his quote was really beautiful and helped to capture that piece. And he shared it in the committee hearing with everyone, which I thought was very brave as well. So the outcome here, after it went through the House committees, it went through the Senate committees, it has passed on the floor, and it has been sent to the governor. I think it was Monday, maybe it was Tuesday, but as of this week, it was sent to the governor to be signed. So we're very excited about this preservation win that did come out of the session this year. Our third strategic focus was around fully funding the fiscal year 2024 Historic Preservation Special Category grants. Is everybody aware of the Division of Historical Resources grants? Good. I see nodding where there's not. Okay, so the deadline is June 1st, so you might miss it for this year, but next year it is a grant program that is administered through the Division of Historical Resources, and they give funding, the special category grants, for actual brick and mortar preservation. So if you want to go downstairs to our table, we have the book from this year, but there are communities throughout the state that may need a new roof put on a historic building, or there may need to be ADA accessibility added to their historic resource, and this grant provides the funding to actually do those projects throughout the state. So there's an application process, and then once you go through the application process, the Florida Historical Commission actually reviews those applications and ranks them, and then we go to the legislature and ask the legislature to fund the list. We always ask for fully funding the list because that captures all the projects, but theoretically there's a running total of the projects, and they could fund it maybe to $1 million. And then you can look at the list and see how many projects you can get for $1 million. So it's a wonderful tool that you might want to consider looking at. It's probably too late to pull it all together for this year, but for next year, the deadline is June 1st. You can just go to the Division of Historical Resources website to find out more information about that. And then there's also a small matching grant that helps to fund things more like surveys and things like that. So if you have a survey project versus a bricks and mortar project, you got both options there. And if you're in a Main Street, then you don't have to do the match. So many benefits to being a Main Street community. So here's this year's, the fiscal year 2024. We're always working for the year ahead, but here's where all of these grants would be for this year. So you can see there's several in Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, a couple up in Leon County where I live, but they really span the state. And there's a great diversity of the kind of projects that they would fund as well, and the historical eras and the stories they tell are very diverse. So this year's list that made it onto the ranked list, there was 33 projects with a price tag of about almost $8.5 million, so pretty heavy lift, but we advocated for fully funding that list. Here's just a quick look at that book I mentioned. We create a page for each grant with a picture and the story and what the need is, and then when we go do our advocacy during the year for that district that the lawmaker represents, we would have like a little post-it there with his district and his story. And if he was number 33 on the list, he'd be really motivated to fully fund that grant program. So the good news is that was fully funded. We did get in the Senate and the House full funding of the special category grants and the small matching grants. So that's going to be a great thing for communities throughout the state of Florida for the year 2024. And we're going to do it all again for 2025 here in a hot second. A few more updates from the SHPO's office. These were not our strategic priorities, but I thought this was a good place to include them in our legislative update. This session saw the approval of a Black History Museum task force. So the division will work on creating recommendations and a plan for a potential Black History Museum in the state. And also there was an increase of funds for the Florida Main Street program, which is a wonderful thing for the state. And we also got approval for new positions in the Division of Historical Resources, which is great news because they do wonderful work. It's very important. And then this is just Ruben Acosta doing a historic property survey in Newport Richey at our conference a few years ago. All right, so our fourth legislative focus, the one that was kind of thrust upon us, was a response to this preemptive legislation. Many of you have probably heard about it. It was the Safe Structures Act. And it was a hot mess. Let's be real about it. It was Senate Bill 1346, sponsored by Senator Avila, and House Bill 1317, sponsored by Representative Roach, and it would have allowed for the demolition of historic structures, which is not great, but then it also would have taken away the ability to have local communities say what is going to be built back. So it would have been a sort of really a double-edged sword. This was really going to impact our coastal communities around the state. So this is where we have organizations like the Miami Design Preservation League that really help to step up and activate their constituents and get some advocacy happening to make this not happen for us. It wasn't just that Miami, though. We had St. Pete, we had Key West, we had St. Augustine, Pensacola. People from around the state came together to talk about how this was not a great idea for preservation in Florida. And then we drew the line about preservation and economics and how people come to these places to experience some of that history. And so to take them away doesn't just impact our culture, but it impacts our bottom line. So as part of our campaign to make this happen, we supported the great work the Miami Design Preservation League did. The previous slide, that was a screenshot from a webinar Lunch and Learn that he did to connect folks and stakeholders from around the state. This is the National Trust for Historic Preservations on the left over here. This was their e-blast that they did. They sent it to all of their 16,000 members in Florida, and it kind of in a very beautifully succinct way talked about the threat. And they have this great platform. You can just click it, and that message goes right to your lawmakers. So that really helped us. This was some graphics and advocacy that we pulled together at the Florida Trust that talked about why design review is important, why demolition review is important. We aren't trying to necessarily stop growth in our communities, but we do want to have the opportunity to mitigate loss when it comes to historic preservation. So the bill moved very quickly, and this just kind of tracks it in the House. It sailed through the first 3 committees, and then here in the Senate, it sailed through the first 3 committees and got to the full vote on the floor. And we use some real life stories to help tell the story. So here is an image of a 19th century historic district in Miami Beach. All buildings shown are on the National Register, but none of them were individually listed. So this is some of the particularly concerning things about this piece of legislation. We did meet with the sponsors and have there be an exclusion for buildings that are on the National Register, but that was only for those that were individually listed. So if you were in a National Register district like this, those would have been included in the bill. So if you had that building in the middle there, if it was individually listed, then it couldn't be demolished without review, but all of the rest of them could. So we worked very hard to have that language changed, so the exclusion would be for districts, not just individually listed. This is just another example of a building that was not individually listed. So you would have a tremendous impact on historic resources throughout the state. So I just wanted to take a moment here to, again, focus on the importance of collaboration. I think that it was through our organizations working together that we were able to have a big impact on this. And it was sometimes stakeholders that we don't get to bring to the table to collaborate when we're doing advocacy. We had great response and support from local elected officials, from cities and counties, including St. Petersburg. Then you also had that line, I don't think you can read it, but it says preservation boards around the state. So preservation boards themselves would send people to the Capitol or send messages to their lobbyists and work with the city. Then we have preservation organizations. We work together on this. And then even other nonprofits like the Florida League of Cities and Thousand Friends of Florida, they worked with us together on this to fight this. And I'm happy to tell you that it did not happen. It died. So that's the good news. And we'll talk about the bad news when we go to next steps. But for the good news. So finally here, as I kind of wrap up, because I know we have another speaker coming on here in a minute, but as part of our strategy, particularly around the tax credit, we created a organization called the Tax Credit Alliance, and it's for those who are maybe developers or tax credit syndicators that may work in other states. We kind of pulled them together almost as a advisory group so we could learn best practices from how other states have created the program, also how they implement it, also how they demonstrate the value of it, because we know that's going to be an important piece of this fight as we move forward once we get it passed. So we have this new kind of advisory group come together called the Tax Credit Alliance. There's more information on our website or downstairs if you'd like to learn more about that. But basically, there's a membership component to it as well. But we want to work in that collaborative way that we talked about to get the state historic tax credit passed. So we have this important tool for all of our communities. And that tour that I talked about in Jacksonville, that was actually made possible through the Tax Credit Alliance because the developers who are doing that big, giant project, they see the value of having a tax credit passed in Florida, so they opened up their site to us, and hosted us in this beautiful tour. We had 7 lawmakers there, as well as the Secretary of State, 5 different media organizations. So it was a great tool to kind of tell the story more broadly. So when we talk about next steps, we are already thinking forward for the 2024 legislative session. We know that Safe Structures bills is probably going to come back. The sponsors have said themselves that it's definitely going to come back. So we want to be more proactive this year and pull together some stories and data and definitely strengthen our collaboration before the session, because we know that's going to come again. We're going to be working on the tax credit again this year. We will again be asking to fully fund our Division of Historical Resources grant programs. So if you are interested in being a part of any of that, some ways that you can do that is by becoming a member of the Florida Trust. We also have an advocacy update that is sent every week during session that gives you all of the updates on what happened that week. So you could sign up to join that advocacy list. We don't send it to everyone in our membership database because not everybody wants to be spammed with weekly updates on what's going on in the Florida legislature, but we do it. Also, our conference coming up in Ocala in July, we have information about that. That's a great way to get involved and get engaged, and we will absolutely be doing a session on preservation incentives there and the tax credit there as well. You yourself can engage with lawmakers. That's like a whole different conversation that could probably be going on with Preserve the Burg in the future, but that piece is really important, and when the lawmakers are not in Tallahassee, they're here in their district. It's a great time to, maybe even a better time to get to speak with them and talk to them about how important it is for you and the historic resources that are under their care, really. And we can help with that. Our regional council here can help with that if you need help. You could become a member of the Tax Credit Alliance if you're in a business capacity and you're interested in doing that. And actually next week I am doing a lunch and learn that's online. If you would like to learn more about advocacy and outreach campaigns, building those for your own communities. And then, of course, you're welcome to come to Tallahassee and join us for the January Advocacy Day when we go back to the Capitol and meet with all of our lawmakers. So that's really all I had that I was going to go over for our advocacy update. I was going to answer questions, though. Yes. Linda asked if I could mention our regional council. So in that, when you think back to our mission and those 4 pillars that support our mission, the one that said connect, we've broken the state up into regions so that we can better get into our communities and support preservationists there. So we are in region 5. We're in region 5. And we have our regional ambassadors here with us today. So we are having events. When's the next happy hour? We'll circle back on that, but there's monthly happy hours that you can come and be a part of, kind of engage with other preservationists from around the state, and that information's on our website as well. Sir, do you have a question?
I took a quick look at the list of grants, people receiving grants. They all appear to be municipalities. Is it restricted to government entities or not?
No, it is not. So I don't think that all of them were municipalities, but maybe some of them were, but No, it's not just municipalities. In fact, individual nonprofit organizations, house museums, universities, they've all been the beneficiaries of grants throughout the state. Yes?
What is the scoring based upon?
So the Historical Commission has a whole ranking criteria guide that they look through. So they look at things like, is the organization able to manage a grant? What is the history and the story? Does it tell the story of an underrepresented community? Is it in complete disrepair, and is this grant going to make a difference? There's a whole bunch of criteria. They're very thoughtful about it. And then there's actually a panel that they convene after they've kind of gotten the list, and the applicants are able to come up and sort of answer questions and present their case before the whole panel. So it's a wonderful process. Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes.
So I just moved to Florida, and you don't have state income tax here for individuals, so I assume that tax credit is just for commercial properties then, or?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. The question was, because Florida does not have a state income tax, what is the credit going against? And that has been a challenge for us. Florida is the only one of our neighbors that doesn't have a state historic tax credit. There's 36 other states that do have this great tool, but it's a challenge for us because we don't have the state income tax. So we look to Texas, which is the only state that doesn't have a state income tax, but does have a historic preservation tax credit. And what they did successfully, and what we have mirrored in ours, is it goes against the franchise tax and the insurance tax. So we have found a way to get that credit without there being the income tax piece. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but there is a secondary market, which is a component of all of the successful statewide historic tax credit, in my opinion, the successful historic tax credit projects. So if you were a nonprofit and you wanted to do something, well, you're not taxed anyway. So this secondary market would enable you to kind of sell it to another organization that would have a tax need for those credits. So it would enable other organizations as well to benefit from it. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys very much, and I hope that you will go down to the Florida Trust table and we'll talk more. I appreciate it.